There is a diary entry dated May 14, 1858, written somewhere between the South Fork of the Platte River and the dry, wind-scarred hills that rose beyond it at approximately mile 412 from Independence, Missouri. The handwriting is careful at the start. Eleanor Marsh was a precise woman, a schoolteacher's daughter, someone who had always believed that words meant something if you chose them carefully enough. But by the middle of the page the letters begin to slant, the pressure of the pen deepening, as though she was driving the thought into the paper to make it hold. The entry reads, "I have told Ruth that I require a husband before we reach Fort Laramie, or we will not survive this journey in any form of dignity." She laughed. I did not. I am 34 years old. I have buried one husband already, and I have no particular interest in romance. What I need is a practical arrangement, a name on paper, a man willing to be counted. What the diary does not mention, because Eleanor could not have known it at the time, is that a man named Caleb Ward was standing approximately 10 feet from the back of her wagon when she said those words aloud. He had been walking beside the Marsh wagon for 11 days. He would walk beside it for another 150 miles before he said a single word about what he'd heard. Eleanor Marsh had not intended to cross the Oregon Trail alone. That distinction belongs to her brother-in-law, Daniel Hatch, who died of cholera at a ford of the Little Blue River on the 1st of May, 1858, 13 days after the wagon train rolled out of Independence, Missouri, and 51 days before Eleanor had imagined anything could go seriously wrong. She had come this far for practical reasons. Thomas Garrett, a widower with 160 acres in the Willamette Valley, had placed a notice in an Ohio newspaper in the winter of 1857. He was seeking a wife, industrious, of good character, willing to work. He was 41 years old. He had been honest in his letter about what he was offering: land, a solid house, 2 young sons who needed a mother's attention. He had been equally honest about what he was not offering. He did not use the word love. He said instead that he believed in fair dealing. Eleanor had written back. She was a widow herself, her husband George having died of a fever 3 years prior, leaving her a small house she had since sold, a debt she had since paid, and a life that had grown very quiet and very small in ways that felt some mornings like they were actively pressing in on her. She was not a romantic. She was not naive. She had read Thomas Garrett's letter 4 times, recognized a proposition when she saw one, and written back with her own list of honest terms. He had agreed to all of them, so she had sold what remained, the furniture, the good dishes, a clock her mother had given her, packed what she could carry, and joined her sister Ruth and Daniel for the journey west. Ruth had been against it, in the gentle, persistent way that Ruth was against most things, not loud, just present, always there with another quiet concern. But Eleanor had her own reasons, ones she didn't share. She needed to go somewhere her life could be different. She needed distance, and room, and the possibility of waking up in a place where no one remembered her as someone who had already lost everything once. Thomas Garrett's land in the Willamette Valley was as far as a woman could reasonably get in 1858. She had carried his last letter in the left pocket of her apron since independence. She had not opened it since Daniel died. Daniel Hatch died on a Thursday, which Eleanor would later think was an odd thing to remember but could not stop herself from noting in the diary. 13 days out from Independence, the wagon train was fording the Little Blue River in southern Nebraska, at a crossing that was muddier and higher than the wagon master had hoped. The oxen made it, the wagon made it. Daniel himself had waded in to guide the wheel team across, the way the men in the company had been doing all morning, and he had come out the other side looking pale and odd, and by that evening he was sick in the way that everyone on the Oregon Trail recognized and nobody said aloud. By Sunday he was gone. Ruth had grieved in a way that was very Ruth. Quiet on the outside, something internal collapsing slowly, like a structure whose supports had been removed one by one. She had not broken down. She had made biscuits the morning after Daniel died because the children in the wagon ahead of theirs had been crying from hunger, and Ruth could not hear a hungry child and do nothing. Eleanor had stood beside the cook fire and watched her sister mix flour and grease by firelight, and thought, "We are going to have to figure this out." The wagon train company, 31 wagons, led by a wagon master named Aldrich, who had made the crossing 3 times and had no patience for complications, gave Eleanor 2 days to organize herself before making the situation clear. 2 women traveling without male supervision were a liability. Not his word, but his meaning. He was not a cruel man. He was a practical one. He told Eleanor that she and Ruth could continue with the company if they could find a male member willing to assume responsibility for their wagon in the company ledger, a relative, a neighbor, any man willing to add his name to theirs. Otherwise, they would need to travel with reduced standing, slower pace, fewer resources, last position in the line of march. Eleanor thanked him for his plain speaking. She went back to the wagon and looked at the horizon and did not cry. She had cried already for George 3 years ago, and she was not going to cry twice. Whatever feeling was rising in her chest, she pressed it down and began to think. She first noticed Caleb Ward the morning after Daniel was buried. He was not a remarkable-looking man in most ways. Tall enough, broad in the shoulder in the way that men who had spent their lives working with their hands tended to be, with dark hair that had been cut by someone who was not especially skilled at it and left to grow since. He was traveling alone, which was unusual enough to be noteworthy. Most men traveling without a family were paired with at least one other. Caleb Ward walked alone, with a mule he kept to himself and a bedroll and a small kit of carpenter's tools he kept wrapped in oilcloth, strapped beneath the seat of a borrowed wagon he'd traded labor for back in Missouri. She noticed him because the morning after Daniel died, she came out of the wagon at dawn to check the oxen and found that someone had already done it. The animals had been watered, the yoke had been checked, and a small pile of dry wood had been left beside the cook fire, which she had let go cold the night before and had been dreading the work of rekindling. She looked around. The company was only beginning to stir. Caleb Ward was sitting against his wagon wheel perhaps 50 yards away, eating something from a tin cup, looking in the opposite direction. She could not be certain it was him, but she said thank you in his general direction before she went back to building the fire. He did not respond. He may not have heard her, or he may simply have been the kind of man who did not think thanks were required. Over the following 11 days, the evidence accumulated quietly. The oxen already seen to in the morning. A cracked axle pin on Daniel's wagon, noticed and replaced before Eleanor was aware it had been loose. A water barrel filled during a rest stop when the whole company was occupied with a difficult descent, and Eleanor had not had a spare moment to do it herself. Each time she looked for the source of these small interventions, Caleb Ward was somewhere nearby. Not close, never intrusive, just present in the peripheral way of someone who is paying attention without announcing it. Ruth noticed before Eleanor named it. The quiet man, Ruth called him. He's been watching out for us. Eleanor said she thought Ruth was imagining things. Ruth, who had spent her whole life reading people accurately, said nothing more. She just smiled and went back to the mending in her lap. It was Ruth who made the mistake of laughing. On the evening of May 14th, when Eleanor explained the situation with the precision of a woman who had done the arithmetic 3 times to be sure she had it right, they were past the Platte River's South Fork. Fort Laramie was approximately 230 miles ahead, a week and a half of hard travel if the weather held and the river crossings cooperated. The wagon master had given Eleanor a month to find a solution. That month was running short. Eleanor laid it out plainly. They needed a man willing to add his name to their wagon in the company ledger. Not a husband in any meaningful sense, not necessarily, just a formal arrangement that would let them continue at full standing. One name. A practical agreement between people who understood what was required. I need a husband before Fort Laramie, Eleanor said, or as near to one as the situation allows. Ruth had laughed, not unkindly. She was the kind of woman who laughed when she was nervous, a habit Eleanor had spent 30 years failing to break her of. It isn't funny, Eleanor said. I know it isn't, Ruth said, still smiling. I just never thought I'd hear you say that sentence. What neither of them considered was the canvas of the wagon, open at the back to catch the evening air, and the man standing 10 feet behind it, refilling a water canteen at the barrel strapped to the rear axle. Caleb Ward heard every word. He replaced the cork in the canteen. He set it back in his kit. He walked back to his own wagon, and he sat down, and he looked at the fire for a long time. In the days that followed, he did not bring it up. He did not change his behavior in any visible way. The wood was left, the oxen were seen to. A cracked wagon bow that had been worrying Eleanor for 2 days was quietly repaired while she slept. But he thought about what he'd heard. A man could spend a lot of miles thinking on a thing he wasn't ready to speak aloud. The offer came from Harold Vance, which surprised Eleanor not at all. He was a merchant from St. Louis, traveling with 2 wagons of trade goods and a plan to set himself up in Portland. He was 52 years old, with a beard that he kept very clean and eyes that were always doing a calculation. His wife had died the previous winter. He had 3 grown children back east who had, as far as Eleanor could tell, none of them elected to accompany him. He approached Eleanor formally on the evening of May 18th, 4 days after her conversation with Ruth. He removed his hat, he called her Mrs. Marsh, and he explained that he had heard of her situation, the ledger requirements, the difficulty of 2 women without a male guardian, and that he was in a position to be of assistance. He was not unkind about it. He was, in fact, very smooth. He spoke about practical benefits, the respectability of the arrangement, the fact that his own position in the company would benefit from a sensible alliance. He did not use the word wife. He said companion and partner in the enterprise. Eleanor listened. She asked 3 questions. She did not say yes, but she did not say no. She went back to the wagon and told Ruth, who did not laugh this time. "What did you feel?" Ruth asked. "Nothing," Eleanor said. Which is perhaps the point. She thought about it for 4 days. She thought about Thomas Garrett's letter in her apron pocket, which she still had not opened. She thought about the 160 acres in the Willamette Valley, and the 2 boys who needed a mother's attention, and the deal she had made in Ohio in the cold of the previous winter. She had already made 1 practical arrangement, she reasoned. She might as well make another. She was almost certain she was going to say yes to Harold Vance when she saw him speak to Ruth. It was the 22nd of May, a Tuesday, somewhere south of Ash Hollow, at mile 487. The company had stopped to rest the animals in the midday heat. Harold Vance passed by the Marsh wagon and said something to Ruth, something about the evening's camp assignment, about position in the line of march. Eleanor was not close enough to hear the words, but she saw her sister's face, Ruth, who greeted everyone with warmth. Ruth, who had made biscuits for other people's children the morning after her own husband died. Ruth, whose face had done something in that moment that Eleanor had never seen it do. It had closed, like a door pulled shut from inside. Eleanor watched Ruth watch Harold Vance walk away. Then Ruth turned and found Eleanor looking at her, and she shook her head, just once, very slightly, and went back to the task in her hands. Eleanor had known Ruth for 34 years. She had never once needed her sister to say a thing plainly to understand it. She did not say yes to Harold Vance. The company reached Chimney Rock on the 28th of May at mile 497 on a morning so clear that the formation was visible from 8 miles out. A stone spire rising 325 feet above the Nebraska plain, looking nothing like a chimney and exactly like something that did not belong in this landscape, which was perhaps the point. Emigrants had been carving their names into the soft clay at its base for 15 years by then. Eleanor did not carve anything. She stood and looked at it for 10 minutes and thought that it was beautiful and severe and not unlike this entire journey, which also was beautiful and severe and asked things of her that nothing in her previous life had prepared her for. Caleb Ward was standing 20 feet away, also looking. He did not speak to her. She did not speak to him, but she was aware of him in a way she had been working to not be aware of him since sometime around mile 300, which was approximately when she had understood that the careful, unasked-for kindnesses were not a coincidence. The problem was not that she disliked him. The problem was nearly the opposite. Eleanor Marsh had survived one grief by the mechanism of closing certain chambers of herself very firmly and not going back into them. She had built the arrangement with Thomas Garrett on precisely that foundation. Fair dealing, no room for disappointment. The arrangement she had nearly made with Harold Vance was a lesser version of the same instinct. What she was afraid of, what she had been afraid of since George died, was the thing that lived on the other side of that closed door. The wanting of something. The possibility of wanting something and not receiving it. She had been very careful, for 3 years, not to want anything she could not carry. She looked at Chimney Rock and felt, for a moment, an unfamiliar loosening in her chest. She went back to the wagon. Fort Laramie was miles 645 from Independence, Missouri. By June the 3rd, they were 4 days away. The wagon master informed Eleanor quietly but clearly that her grace period was ending. She had not spoken again to Harold Vance. She understood, in the way that one understands a door closing somewhere in the distance, that the option was probably gone. He had, she'd heard, made other arrangements. A widow from Indiana, also traveling in the company, also in a precarious position. It was a practical man's practical solution. Eleanor was unsurprised. She was also, quietly, relieved, which left her exactly where she had started. 2 women, 1 wagon, 4 days to Fort Laramie, and no solution. She had not slept well in a week. There was something rotating in her chest in the small hours that she could not name. Not fear exactly, something older than fear, something that had to do with all the things she had been careful not to want for 3 years, and that were beginning, in the dark and the vast prairie silence, to press against those carefully shut doors. On the evening of June the 3rd, Ruth developed a cough. It was not the cholera cough. Eleanor listened to it carefully and recognized it for what it was. A head cold, most likely, something in the dust and the temperature change as they climbed toward the high plains. Nothing serious. But Ruth was feverish by nightfall, and Eleanor sat up with her through the worst of it, pressing a damp cloth to her sister's forehead and listening to the enormous dark outside the canvas and thinking about all the ways a plan could come undone, and wondering if she had made every mistake available to her, and whether the mistakes were finished yet. In the morning, Ruth was better. Not well, but better, and Eleanor climbed out of the wagon at first light and found Caleb Ward standing by the oxen. He was not doing anything dramatic. He was checking the near ox's left foreleg, which had been walking slightly uneven for 2 days. He crouched beside it with the particular steadiness of a man who had been around working animals all his life, running his hand down the leg with the same careful attention he gave to everything. Eleanor stood at the back of the wagon and watched him and felt something shift, quietly, in the place she had been keeping closed. She said, "She's been slightly off for 2 days." He said, "I know. She'll be fine. Stone bruise, most likely. She'll work through it." Eleanor said, "You've known for 2 days." He said, "Yes." He stood up and looked at her. He was not a man who looked away when he should have. He had dark eyes and a steadiness in them that Eleanor had been trying not to think about since mile 300. She said, "Mr. Ward, I need to ask you something directly." He said, "All right." She said, "Have you been looking after this wagon since Daniel died?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because it needed looking after." Eleanor stood in the early morning light, the wet grass cold against her boots, the oxen breathing in their slow, patient way, and she thought about 3 years of closed doors and practical arrangements and the letter in her apron pocket that she had not opened since the 1st of May. She said, "We have 4 days to Fort Laramie." He said, "I know." She said, "The wagon master." He said, "I know that too." She said, "I'm not asking for—" She stopped, she started again. "I am asking only for a practical arrangement. A name on the ledger." He said, "Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her name. She waited. He said, "I heard what you told your sister, back at mile 412. I've been thinking about it since." She said nothing. He said, "I'm not going to offer you a practical arrangement." The silence stretched between them, and in the distance a meadowlark called once and was quiet. She said, "Then what are you offering?" He said, "Something better. Or I'd like to try." He was looking at her with those steady dark eyes, and she thought about George, and she thought about Thomas Garrett's letter, and she thought about Ruth's face closing like a door when Harold Vance walked away. She thought about Chimney Rock and the unfamiliar loosening in her chest. She said, "I have a man waiting in Oregon City." He said, "I know." She said, "We made an arrangement." He said, "I know." She said, "I don't know anything about you," he said. "You know more than you think." And that was true. She did. She knew that he rose before dawn. She knew that he did not speak unless he had something worth saying. She knew that he had spent 51 days walking beside her wagon without once asking for acknowledgement, without once making his presence into something she owed him for. She knew what kind of man leaves dry wood by a cold fire at 4 in the morning for a woman he barely knows. She knew what kind of man does it 50 times without mentioning it. She said, "I'll think about it." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He walked back to his wagon with the unhurried step of a man who had learned to wait for things that were worth waiting for. Eleanor stood in the cold morning air with the damp grass at her boots and the oxen breathing beside her, and something was turning over and over in her chest that she was not going to be able to press back down. Ruth appeared at the back of the wagon, wrapped in a blanket. Her face still pale from the night, but her eyes sharp as they always were. She said, "I heard all of that." Eleanor said, "I know." Ruth said, "Eleanor." Eleanor said, "I know." Ruth said, "You have been carrying that letter since May the 1st." Eleanor said nothing. Ruth said, "Open it." She opened Thomas Garrett's letter that evening, sitting by the fire with the last light dying in the west, and Fort Laramie 3 days and one river crossing ahead. He had good handwriting, Thomas Garrett, clear and careful, the handwriting of a man who meant what he put on paper. He told her that his oldest boy had taken sick in January and was still recovering. He told her that the spring planting was looking favorable. He told her several ordinary things about his life in the Willamette Valley, the kind of details a man shares when he is trying to give someone an honest picture of what they are walking toward. And then, at the bottom of the page, in slightly different ink, written later, she thought, on a different day than the rest, he had added one more thing. He wrote that he had heard from a cousin recently come from Ohio that she had sold her house and settled her affairs and was genuinely coming. That he had felt, on reading this, something unexpected. That he was not certain he could describe it, but that he wanted to be honest with her, as he had tried to be from the beginning, and so he wanted to say he was glad. He was looking forward to knowing her. "I hope the road is not too hard," he wrote. "I hope you find, somewhere in the journey, something that surprises you." A person deserves at least one surprise. Eleanor sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. Then she got up and walked, in the half-dark of the prairie evening, to Caleb Ward's wagon. He was sitting outside it, working on a piece of wood with a small knife, shaping something she couldn't make out in the low light. He looked up when she came. She said, "I need to write a letter." He waited. She said, "I need to write to a man in Oregon City and tell him that I cannot come, that I'm sorry for the inconvenience, that I believe he will find what he is looking for." Caleb set down the wood. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you certain?" She said, "I have been walking beside something I didn't expect for 400 miles. I think I should stop walking past it." He stood up. He was not a man who moved quickly toward anything. He reached out one hand, the way you reach toward something you've wanted long enough that you want to be sure it's real. She took it. They were married at Fort Laramie on the 9th of June, 1858, by a chaplain who performed the ceremony between supply runs and did not make it long. Ruth stood beside Eleanor in a dress that was not clean but was her best, and the meadowlark that had been calling all morning went quiet just as the vows were said, and Eleanor thought that was the kind of detail that would embarrass her if she wrote it in the diary, and she wrote it anyway. She sent a letter to Thomas Garrett that afternoon. It took her 3 drafts. He wrote back, months later, after they had reached the Willamette Valley, after Caleb had already begun felling timber for the house he was building on the land they'd claimed under the Donation Land Act, 160 acres in the valley, the grass so green after the dry miles of the trail that Eleanor had stood at the edge of it and put her hand over her mouth. Thomas Garrett's reply was brief and kind. He had found his own surprise, he wrote. A woman from Missouri, also widowed, also practical, who had come to Oregon the previous year. He thought Eleanor would like her. He wished them well. She tucked his letter into the diary, between the entry from May the 14th and the entry from June the 9th. The one from May read, I require a husband before Fort Laramie, or we will not survive in any dignity. The one from June read, I was wrong about what I required. What I required was to stop being so careful about what I wanted, and to let something real come close enough to matter. Caleb put 3 more fence posts in today and showed me where he means to build the kitchen garden. Ruth says the cough is gone entirely. The grass here is so green it looks invented. I did not know in May that I had already been walking beside my answer for 400 miles. I should have. He left wood by the fire.